would like again to welcome everybody to the forum today, where we're going to talk about the current state of trust. Now, we assume that trust is related to giving behavior. And for this particular forum, I dug into three pretty recent studies that were done about trust and nonprofits. Trish, if you would, could you advance to the next slide? So these three sources I always recommend. If you want to go back to the original source, please do so. These three sources are listed on the slide here. The first one comes from Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. These are the folks that you may know who are heavily involved in putting out Giving USA every year, that kind of large scale survey of the practice of philanthropy in America. They've put it out for 40 years. The second one comes from Independent Sector, which is a nonprofit made of other nonprofits. They do a lot of research and advocacy work on the behalf of nonprofits and large philanthropies, family foundations, and other NGOs in our sector. And then the final one comes from the Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Alliance. If you are familiar with their website, give.org, they're one of those charity watchdog kind of organizations that's out there to inform donors. And so they surveyed donors about some of their beliefs and their trust in nonprofits. Marty? Oh, I'll drop those resources. I'll drop links to those in the chat while Marty tells you a few things.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mary. So we thought it was important to throw out a couple of definitions here to get us started. I think we all know that trust is central to giving, but let's talk a bit, since we're the scope of these studies, about the terms on the slide there. Social trust, first of all, is defined as a broad belief in the honesty, integrity, and reliability of others. We know it requires that like leap of faith, right? We can see how that is central to the giving experience. It's fluid. It's based on history as well as current context. And guess what? It can change over time. Just because you have someone's trust today does not mean that you have it forever. It's something that we have to work on, right? It requires vulnerability. And social trust is different for each organization, but it is strongly connected to how you deliver on your mission, right? So keeping in mind that nonprofits are centrally focused on delivering on their mission, people are looking to us to deliver on our missions. Let's talk a little bit about a lack of trust, right? That's usually rooted in people not knowing a lot about the organization or the issue or the topic, right? It's normal to kind of have that self-protective fear. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative judgment. It just means that we may not have enough information. So lack of trust is an opportunity for us to build on. Whereas mistrust is probably more active doubt, right? People are skeptics, and those feeling mistrust might have a lot of questions. But the good news is they're usually open to new information. One example of this is artificial intelligence, right? There's a lot of public discussion about whether it's the best thing or the worst thing. People have a lot of questions, but that active asking and questioning could be defined as that mistrust. And then lastly, we have distrust, right? A settled belief that the organization or the category of organizations, the issues, the topics are just not trustworthy. This is the most problematic trust deficit because people feeling distrust are really not open to new information. So that can be a really difficult hill to climb if we are in that category ever, right? So keep all of those terms in mind as we walk through the content here. We thought it would be fun today to do a little bit of philanthropy feud. So we're going to do 2 rounds where we're going to invite you to either feel free to drop in the chat or shout out your answers to the questions that I ask. Again, the data for this little game show is going to come from the sources that Mary talked about. And so if you have taken a look at those, you might have a head up, or if you're peeking at the links that she dropped in the chat, you might understand, but you'd have to read pretty quickly. So let's move on to the next slide. The first question is, who do Americans not trust, right? So we are talking about The question that was asked was, how much do you trust the following entities to generally do what is right? What types of organizations do you think ranked the lowest? When we were talking about, oh, government, that came up twice already. Politicians, y'all are good, right? Keep on shouting them out. Let's go before I put it up. Ditto, politicians, government. Yep, we're on to something here. Door-to-door salesman. I love it. Banking. Thank you. Thanks for participating. Well, let's go ahead and jump onto that next slide and see what the survey showed. So again, keeping in mind the question was, how much do you trust the following entities? So these are like how much people trust these. So large corporations actually did the worst, right? Only 5.8% of respondents trust large corporations. Then we have Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, state and local government. So all those of you who put that government on there in politics, you were pretty accurate, right? Small businesses, universities, and individuals was about 20%. Can anyone guess the percentage of Americans that trust nonprofits to generally do what is right? Anyone? Yes. This is who we trust to generally do what is right. So I'm gonna go ahead. Anybody want to take a stab at what percent of people trust nonprofits to generally do what is right? 33% Lee Grisham, 75, 52, 50. We got lots of great shout outs. 80%. Well, guess what, y'all? Lee was the closest. Only 39% of people trust nonprofits generally to do what is right. Eek, that hurts, right? So 2 out of every 5 people in general thinks we're going to do what's right. That's not great. We got to keep working on that. But guess what? It's a whole lot higher than all of those groups. So maybe we're doing something right, right? We can move on into that next slide. I want to talk about who are these 39% of people that trust nonprofits, right? So what are their demographics? This can get a little fuzzy because not all of the surveys were exactly worded the same. We didn't ask all the different groups the same specific demographic questions, but we want you to shout out some thoughts on what characteristics might indicate someone is more likely to trust a nonprofit. No right or wrong answers here. Feel free. Millennials, 65 and older. This is good. These are, throw out whatever thoughts. Who do we think? What types, characteristics, types of people? Think, you're thinking along the ages, college degree. There you go. Politically active people. Think about our constituents, right? How do you segment your donors? How do you segment people? Just any types of groups of people who work in nonprofits. These are some great responses. Survey says, Trish, let's go to that next slide. More highly educated. So somebody got that, right? We know that is defined as someone who held at least a bachelor's degree. They didn't do any more specific than that on, if people with higher education, even than that, like had, a bigger trust or not. But if you held at least a bachelor's degree, that was much more trusting. And I think that it's easy to look and say donors and volunteers, well, duh, our donors and our volunteers trust us. But this was the fun fact on this for me. Donors and volunteers to any nonprofit were more likely in general to trust nonprofits in general. So not just that they were trusting of their nonprofits that they supported and gave to and volunteered for. So I think that's an important takeaway for us. Next, I'm going to hand it back to Mary to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these nuances that get a little more fuzzy.
Yeah, so Trish, if we could have advance the slide. So here's where, like Marty said, here's where it got kind of fuzzy. So the different surveys showed some different numbers and also asked some different questions across these sorts of categories. Like one survey said that the men that they surveyed trusted nonprofits more than the women that they did. Another one of them said that women trusted it more than men. So like, this is not to like counteract what Jared was talking about earlier. It's just that data is unclear, maybe linked to the way that the question was phrased. Similarly, one of the surveys said that people who identified as being Asian trusted nonprofits significantly more than people who identified as being white or Black, and a lot more, actually, than people who identified as being Hispanic or Latino. Another survey found that people who identified as white and non-Hispanic were more likely to trust nonprofits than other people who had different racial or ethnic identities. Similarly for generations. So, like I saw somebody shouting out that people 65 and older, or maybe millennials, trusted nonprofits more. One survey said that younger people, so like Gen Z and millennials, were more trusting. Another said that people who were in the boomers or even the generation one older than them, labeled as matures, were more trusting than Gen X and younger. It's just unclear. I was actually kind of relieved to see so much noise in the data as I was going through this, because it reminds us that we're working with unique human beings, and it keeps us fundraisers from like zeroing in on, okay, I'm just going to look for the millennial Asian women with master's degrees in my database because they're going to be the most philanthropic. Like, these are individuals that we're working with. Next slide, please, Trish. But seriously, even though we said 39% of people trust us, they do trust us because they see us as the best option. This comes directly from one of the surveys, this graphic, because they do trust us more than business or government or the media to make a positive difference on quality of life issues like healthcare and poverty. Next slide, please. They also trust us more than the other guys, at least, to make a positive difference on really politically divisive issues. So these are the issues that many people feel are tearing the American social fabric apart. It's kind of powerful, I think, hearing that we nonprofits, we're the last best hope, but then I really do think that we've kind of known that all along at some level. That's why we all work in this field, right? Next slide, please, Trish. Okay, so what did the survey respondents want us to do to be more trustworthy, according to the report writers? Well, there were some basic common sense recommendations about transparency, like have your 990 posted on your website and your audited financials if you have those, and make sure that people could see the actual human beings connected to your organization on your website. This would be like listing board and staff, making sure that they can reach a person if they call you on the phone, as opposed to just being lost in like a phone tree and always just getting a voicemail where they leave a message. So these are the sorts of things that you're probably already doing. One of the surveying organizations actually asked people if they would be more likely to give to an organization with a third-party trust certification. So like Better Business Bureau has their giving.org seal of approval. I think Candid, what used to be Charity Navigator, has one of these things. And people said that they would be more likely to give if you had one of these. But while I do think that these seals of approval are growing in importance for nonprofits like of national stature who are operating across the entire country, I don't really know that they engender more trust for organizations at the community level. And I think that that's most of who Pride serves. So if you've got the staff bandwidth to pursue one of these, I won't tell you not to do it, but I mean, I don't think it's going to be this blanket solution that the people doing these surveys want to think that it's going to be. I know I'm a sample size of one, but I've gone through one of these certification processes. The organization I work for even like won a trophy because we were so good at it, and it resulted in exactly this much more revenue coming in. The independent sector survey actually said that 61% of people would increase their trust, though, if the organization committed to a set of guidelines and ethical principles for its operations. So I would suggest this wholeheartedly. It's not something that's hard to implement at your organization. The Association of Fundraising Professionals has a great code of ethics. If you're a member, you sign it every year. Another option is just to make sure that your staff and volunteers are familiar with the Donor Bill of Rights and that they articulate it to prospective donors whenever they're cultivating, whenever they're meeting with those folks, or whenever they're making an ask. If you talk about it, the people hearing that will know that you take it seriously. And I believe that that will influence their feelings of trust towards your organization and towards really nonprofits as a whole. So another one of the surveys asked people about a couple of hot button issues, like things to avoid. One of the stats that really jumped out at me has to do with the use of artificial intelligence. There was a specific statistic in one of the studies that said that 70% of respondents from households with an income of $200,000 or more. So these are like households that we want to trust us, that we believe that they would be likely in a position to make gifts to support our organizations. Well, those folks said 70% of them said that they would be discouraged from giving to a charity if they learned that that charity had used an artificial intelligence generated image in the solicitation. I don't know about you. I haven't seen, I mean, like I saw Balenciaga Pope. I've seen some of the artificial intelligence generated images out there. Not all of them look crazy bad, but a lot of them that I've tried to generate look crazy bad. People have extra fingers. Like, it's obvious to me that this was not a real picture. But if you were using the AI images in your solicitations and people found out, they might be pretty turned off. Younger people said they were more open to the use of AI in charity appeals, but more than half of people who responded said that they wanted some human eyeballs on that appeal before it went out the door. So if you're using AI in any part of your generation of fundraising appeals, people say they want to be told. Second, respondents said that they didn't trust nonprofits to stay out of partisan politics. So as we move towards this fall's election, just be aware of this. I mean, many people trust nonprofits to provide a place for people of different political backgrounds to work together, but they don't trust nonprofits when it comes to giving unbiased advice about candidates, helping to write laws, participating in voter registration activities. I don't know that this is actually a verdict on nonprofits as much as it is a verdict on politics these days. That, I mean, we all said that the government and politicians, whenever we were shouting out our answers, like that was the most common one that came up. So I think most of the organizations that we serve don't have advocacy arms, so you're not likely to like step in this hole this fall, but do be mindful of this as we head into election season. Trish, could you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so this dovetails in really nicely with the pride angle. Marty talked about how volunteers to any nonprofit trust all nonprofits more. So use volunteers. We like I'm sorry, I've lost my place. We talked about how the volunteer experience at any nonprofit makes makes volunteers trust all nonprofits more. So just find ways to engage volunteers at your nonprofit in fundraising or in other activities and service delivery activities. Second data point here had to do with where people get their news versus where they most trust the information. So the largest percentage of people reported that they get their news from like their local TV news. But about the same percentage of people get their news from social media. It really was not far off. But 2/3 of people trust the news that they get from their friends and family, compared to just a little over half of people trust their local news from the TV, and only 39% of people trust the news that they get off social media. So this means that word of mouth about your organization from friends and family who are volunteering at your organization is really important. Use volunteers and train them on how to talk about your organization and share their experiences. They can be very powerful in building this foundation of trust for your organization. Final factoid from all these studies, and this may be like the nuggetiest of nuggets that I found in all of this stuff. The Indiana University survey asked people what kinds of behaviors they included as philanthropy. So, like, you know, the most common things that everybody agreed on is that, like, donating money to charitable organizations is philanthropy, volunteering at charitable organizations is philanthropy. They also ask questions about giving money like directly to another person, a friend or a family member who's in need. Is that philanthropy? There were some generational differences there. But 41% of people born after 1981 believe that making connections across their personal and professional networks is a form of philanthropy. Older Americans, people born before 1981, believe that, but at a lower level, so 38%. And you may say, like, okay, well, the difference between 38 and 41% isn't that much, but whenever you looked at the sample size, it was a statistically significant difference. So I would say that if you have a volunteer fundraising committee that is maybe a bit hesitant about opening their personal and professional networks to help you make connections and raise money for your organization, seed that committee with somebody who's kind of young. Seed that committee with somebody born after 1981, and you may have a statistic likelihood that they will show the rest of the committee how they should be behaving, how we think they should be behaving. And so with that, I think we've come to the time when you can ask questions. So did anybody have any questions? Let's see over here. I wonder if the noise and who trusts us correlates to the type of nonprofit. You know, it might be. There wasn't Tammy, there wasn't specific questions along like what sector of nonprofits that people trusted. It was just nonprofit or not nonprofit, but that you may be onto something there. Anybody else have any questions? Is there data on the levels of trust presented? Vince, could you clarify what your question there? Feel free to unmute and speak up. You don't have to stay muted.
Sure. I was just trying to figure out, and I'm with the Georgia Healthy Families Alliance, and what I was trying to figure out was how much effort to put into the skeptics. Skeptics, you know, once you win them over, I mean, they are like your best evangelists, right? I think. So I was trying to figure out what, if there were percentages, you know, how many people are likely to distrust, mistrust, lack of trust. So I was just trying to get some sense of that, like how much time or effort to put into the those who mistrust, because skeptics would be ones that I would focus on.
Yeah, so whenever those who distrust, some of the questions were structured in such a way where like you had to rate your level of trust for nonprofits on a scale of 1 to 10. And high level of trust for nonprofits was like, I want to say they cut it off at either 8 to 10 or 7 to 10, something like that. And then I would say that there were those people who were in that mistrust category who were probably in the 5 to 7 slot. Anything below 5, I would count as a person who is distrusting of nonprofits. And those folks who really just have thrown out the idea that nonprofits are trustworthy, they're not open to new information. And so, you know, they're not likely to have an epiphany from something that you're going to tell them. It's more like the folks who are in the middle who are kind of undecided. And if you're in a conversation with a person, you may or may not be able to tell where they are on that continuum. And so that, the thing that I was saying about committing to a set of ethical principles, like communicating that may be enough to tip somebody, in your favor.
Mary, I'd love to chime in here because this is a great little plug for PDI. I'm actually working on a session on sort of the principles of trust in general and the things we can do as nonprofits to work on building trust in the space of things like stewardship and communication, just sort of those consistent, reliable messaging and touch points that we can do with all of our donors and all of our communities to hopefully raise the bar. But I think what Mary said at the very beginning, we have to keep in mind that fundraising is a person-to-person sport, right? We are building relationships, one person, one organization at a time, really and truly inspire, the transformational gifts. And so there are things that we can be doing across the board for our programs to best position us in a place of trust. And then hopefully through our volunteer networks and our relationships that we continue to grow and deepen, those intentional activities will also help. But really appreciate the questions and the engagement and involvement on today's sessions. Does anyone have any additional questions for us? If there are none, if you are not already a part of the active Pride family, we would love for you to scan that QR code and set up a time to get to know more about us and us about you. So feel free to do that.